Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. Sorry, we're starting a little bit late. We had some technical issues, but we have those all taken care of. And now we're going to start with our panel on border making and its consequences, North America and the Canadian-U.S. border. I'm Kimberly Collins. I'm on faculty I'm a professor at Public Administration at the California State University in San Bernardino. But we have a great panel for you today. We have three presenters. Unfortunately, one was unable to make it. Our first presenter is Laurie Trautman. She's from the Border Policy Research Institute from Western Washington University in Bellingham. We also have Kathryn Friedman from the University of Buffalo. And then we have Katherine Richardson from San Jose State University, one of the sister universities from our campus. Each presenter will have about 20 minutes, and then we will, if they need the 20 minutes, and then we have a series of questions, and I'm really hoping that we can have a roundtable discussion on the issues that are related to border making along the U.S.-Canadian border. So Laurie, if you'd like to start.
Thank you all for being here at 5 o'clock. You're troopers. It can be hard to stick around this long. But I was the one who put together this panel, and my original concept was to try to pull together different regional expertise and kind of looking at subnational border studies and border management. But as Kimberly mentioned, unfortunately, Heather Nickel, who does Arctic borders in Canada, was unable to make it. So you'll see we still have a fairly good regional representation, and there's some holes there, but that's because there's a lot of areas of the US-Canada border where there's not a whole lot of research as it relates specifically to the border. So as Kimberly mentioned, I'm at the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University. That's located just about 30 kilometers south of the Canadian border, in between Vancouver and Seattle. And I'll start by just explaining briefly what my research institute does, assuming I can get this to work, which... So this is a picture of the Peace Arch crossing, again, that sort of main gateway between Vancouver and Seattle. And you can see there's a very long line of cars, and that long line of cars is actually going into Canada. So my research institute was created in 2005, and that was largely out of a recognition that after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened, we had increasing situations like this, where both US residents and Canadian residents were trying to go back and forth between Washington State and British Columbia, and they were waiting for hours. And it wasn't just people that were waiting for hours, it was goods as well. So the state of Washington decided to create a research institute that was solely dedicated to studying the US-Canada border. And since this is part of the global track and we're supposed to be speaking about the state of border studies, I would point out that my institute, the Border Policy Research Institute, is Kate and I were trying to make sure this was true, the only research institute in the United States that is solely dedicated to studying the US-Canada border, which is really hard to believe when you think about the immense trading relationship between the US and Canada, the fact that we're neighbors, the fact that we have a lot of dual citizens. It's such an immensely important relationship, yet in the United States, to be frank, we are quite ignorant of the importance of the Canadian relationship to the United States. I would say this is not necessarily true at all, and on the Canadian side, there's much more focus on the US relationship. And I also wanted to sort of preface border studies in general between the US and Canada, and I would say that for Canadians on the whole, generally speaking, the border has usually been about trade and facilitating trade. About 2/3 of Canadian imports and exports are traded with the United States, so we are an incredibly important trading partner to Canada. In the United States, the border has, at least in the near distant past, been about security, not about trade. So that's right there a really important tension. We've got one country that's wanting to facilitate that movement and another country that's really wanting to control that movement. So I will start out by giving you sort of a brief analysis of the policy environment that the US and Canada has been in relation to the border, and then talk about where we're at, and then talk a little bit about what's happening at the subnational scale. So after 9/11, for really about a decade, the US struggled with border policy for all over the world, globally speaking, and You know, a lot of our policies were quite reactionary, but there was a lot of good ideas that had been developed between the US and Canada prior to 2011 that kind of sat idle and were on hold until the United States could begin to move past the formation of the Department of Homeland Security and these other kind of reactionary policy measures after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. So what we ended up with was the Beyond the Border Accord, which was signed in 2011 by the US and Canada. It's a joint accord between the two countries. And again, this was kind of taking some of those ideas that had existed prior to 9/11, but just couldn't make their way into policy because of the US preoccupation with security, which for about 10 years was really about inspecting everything that crossed the border and blocking a lot of those flows. So I'll just briefly touch on some of the aspects of the Beyond the Border Accord, but essentially the overall goal was to establish this perimeter framework between the US and Canada, so border security wasn't just about what was happening at the border, but it was about controlling sort of this North American perimeter, and that has its foundations in the NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Program, which was created back in the 1950s. So the Beyond the Border Accord ushered in programs such as joint threat assessments and intelligence sharing. Those are exactly what they sound like. A lot of really important information sharing, data sharing, security sharing between the US and Canada, which requires a very intimate relationship of trust. Right? You have to trust that the other country will take highly secure, highly sensitive information and sort of treat it as you expect it to be treated. We had the development of the Shipwriter program. That's a picture of that program there. You can see this is two officers. One is Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the other is the United States Coast Guard. And these officers are on the same boat, and they're enforcing law regardless of whether it's in Canada or it's in the United States. So the concept is if you have one of these boats, one of these shipwriter boats, and you have somebody fleeing, say, from the US to Canada, that boat can continue to pursue that person, whether they're smuggling drugs or whatever they're doing. It doesn't have to stop at the border, because once that boat crosses into Canadian waters, there's an RCMP, Canadian government official, who can enforce Canadian law and vice versa. So it's a pretty innovative program that's been used, not a whole lot, but still the concept of trust and that relationship of collaboration is highlighted well in the Shipwriter program. We also saw a lot of advancement of what we call trusted trader and trusted traveler programs. These are programs that enable specific companies and specific individuals to get a status that allows them expedited passage through the border. There is about over 1 million or so people enrolled in what's called the Nexus program, which if you're crossing the US-Canada border, you have a dedicated Nexus lane. The questions that you receive from the border agents, whether you're going into Canada or into the United States, are minimal. And the important thing about the Nexus program is that it has a dedicated lane. So that picture I showed in the beginning, where you have these long lines, these unpredictable delays, if you have this trusted traveler status, you don't have to be in that same lane, you have your own lane. It's kind of like when you go through airport security and you have a expedited processing. And the same holds true in the cargo mode. And this is really, really important for the Canada-US border because it inserts a certain level of predictability. You basically know how long it's going to take you to cross the border, so you can plan that into your, whether it's just-in-time freight movements or it's trying to make it to a hockey game in Vancouver. And then we also saw the expansion of what's called the pre-clearance program, which is another really innovative program between the United States and Canada. It's existed in airports since the 1950s, and under the Beyond the Border Accord, just in the last few years, that program has been expanded to the land, marine, and rail mode. So what pre-clearance means is that, say you're in an airport in Canada or in Dubai or in Dublin, these airports exist all around the world, and you're boarding a plane for the United States, you clear US Customs and US Immigration before you even get on that plane. So that does several things. One is it sort of pushes out the threat from the United States, because if you have somebody you don't want to enter the country, they're not entering and having to be sent back. They're just not admitted at all. It also provides a lot of flexibility and sort of dynamic airport management for people. So if you're flying from, say, Dublin to the United States, you're not necessarily on an international flight. You don't have to go through Customs and Border Protection when you land in the United States, so you have the ability to land in airports that might not have those facilities at certain times. Expanding this to the land, the marine, and the rail mode then essentially transforms these processes into people taking trains, people taking ferries, gives a lot of predictability and a lot of more security screening. And a lot of these programs in the Beyond the Border Accord exist because they were first piloted. So they were done in a very small scale, many of those done in the region where I live and work, that Cascadia region between Vancouver and Seattle. And even just the nature of doing a pilot project requires an intense amount of cooperation and coordination and, again, trust between the two federal governments to say, we're going to see how this works here, and then we're going to transform that knowledge to the federal scale, and we'll let those federal agencies turn that into policy. But that is not the situation that we are necessarily in now. U.S.-Canada relations are incredibly strained, and for somebody who studies the U.S.-Canada border, I haven't been doing it for that long, but I never thought that I would see the day when there was this trade war between the U.S. and Canada, and we see articles like this in the Canadian media saying, a Patriot's Guide to Shopping During a Canada-U.S. Trade War, how to sort of hit the U.S. with your wallet. It's very tense times. We have the North American free trade renegotiations going on. They are not going well. There's certain things that have been agreed upon, but the stickier aspects of it have not been agreed upon and will not happen until at least the fall. There's retaliatory tariffs, so the U.S. imposed tariffs on aluminum and steel to Canada. And on Canada Day, just, what would that be, 8 or 9 days ago, July 1st, Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs to the U.S. throughout, I think it's like hundreds of different products. So it's very hard to know how that's actually going to play out or what sort of impact it's going to have. But the nature of it is the problem. We have the U.S. President calling the Canadian Prime Minister very dishonest and weak. Strong language, but that's not necessarily surprising, but it is surprising between two allies and two neighbors and two countries that have had a very, very good relationship for a very long time. One of the things that's most troubling to me is that we find ourselves in a policy void. So I mentioned that Beyond the Border Accord. Well, what new administrations do in the United States and many other countries in the world when they come in is they take the previous administration's policies and they usher them out. Well, sometimes they take them, they turn them into a new name, but they essentially still exist because they worked quite well. Well, right now we have nothing like Beyond the Border Accord to guide U.S.-Canada border policy issues. There's just nothing there. So bureaucrats, agencies, institutions that are trying to figure out ways to advance different border policies don't have a political leadership, and they don't have that overarching policy framework to help guide those advancements of different border policies. That being said, there's still a lot of really important work getting done between the U.S. and Canada. Two examples that I was mentioned today is the Columbia River Treaty. The Columbia River Treaty, which Kate knows much more about than I do. It's essentially a treaty between the U.S. and Canada that was signed in the 60s for the joint management of dams and water control between the U.S. and Canada and the Columbia River, which is in Washington State, British Columbia. That treaty had some provisions that were expiring and required the U.S. and the Canada to do some renegotiations. Well, for a couple years, Canada was not bringing a lead negotiator to the table, and just recently, in the last few months, those negotiations have been initiated. So there was many of us that thought, given the strained relationship between the U.S. and Canada, the bandwidth will not be there for these countries to come together and work on something like the Columbia River Treaty, but we are seeing it happening. Another very important sort of positive movement in U.S.-Canada relations is the advancement of regulatory alignment. This is something that is fairly unpoliticized, so it's continuing to be advanced. And essentially, there's a lot of different regulations on both sides of the border. One example that I like to highlight, because it seems like such a ridiculous one, is that Canada and the United States have different standards for car seats. So technically, if I have my car seat in the back of my car and I drive into Canada, I should be buying a new one that meets Canadian standards. Well, that's ridiculous, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense. So the idea behind regulatory alignment is not necessarily that the U.S. and Canada are harmonizing all of these standards, say, for example, for a car seat, but we're saying, you know what, your standard is different than mine, but I will trust your standard because we have this relationship of trust. So the basic question that I want to ask today, and that I've been asking myself and many of us who study the border, is can that strong institutional fabric and collaborative relationship that the U.S. and Canada have built over decades and decades, can that endure in the absence of a policy framework or political leadership? I'm not going to try and answer that today. I'm just posing the question. So in my last part of my presentation, I wanted to go beyond that federal scale and beyond those sort of political shows and look at what's happening actually at the subnational scale and at the day-to-day interactions and the day-to-day work that's happening on the border. And I would argue that there's a lot of good stuff that's still happening, and those of us who live in the borderlands, who study the border, who are most affected by the border, are continuing to work together and advance U.S.-Canada relations and border policy as well. So just to orient you a little bit, this is a map of the US-Canada border. When this is the 3 major regions, we call them sort of like the big 3 gateways between the US and Canada. In the east is the Buffalo-Niagara region. In the center is the Detroit-Windsor region. The Detroit-Windsor region is kind of the automobile manufacturing hub between the US and Canada. And then way out west is the Cascadia region. And again, that sort of gateway between Seattle and Vancouver, where British Columbia and Washington State meet up. And I mentioned previously the idea behind pilot projects, and that some of those pilot projects have been done in my region. And I think what I'm going to talk about now, the institutional fabric and sort of the relational structure between Washington State and British Columbia, a lot of that is fed by the fact that we are way, way far away from the capitals of Ottawa and DC. And there's always sort of been this mentality that's like, we're not going to, we're far away from the capitals. We're not going to rely on our federal policymakers. We're going to figure out what works for us, and we're going to do these pilot projects, and we're going to try and shape our own policy. And sometimes that actually does work, even though the border is, of course, federal jurisdiction. So outlining sort of what are the scales of institutional collaboration, what are these strong relationships that exist between the US and Canada that support the border that hopefully I do think will endure this problematic federal relationship. So there's 3 main ones that I wanted to touch upon today. This is at the national scale. We have something called the Canada-US Transportation Border Working Group. And this is just what it sounds like, the Transportation Border Working Group. And even though it's at the national scale, there's a really large sort of contingent from the Pacific Northwest or from the Cascadia region that participates in this group. And this is essentially transportation planners in both Canada and the United States coming together and looking at best practices. So something that works on a port of entry that's a bridge, say, between Buffalo and Niagara, might not work so well in the land border environment between British Columbia and Washington State. So we come together twice a year and we sort of talk about those things and how does it work when you want to expand a port of entry going into Canada? Do you need to expand it going into the US as well? And how do you expand the transportation infrastructure around that? At the regional scale in Cascadia, we have a group called the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. This is a pretty unique organization. I don't know, certainly there's nowhere else along the US-Canadian border that this type of organization exists. I'm sure there's other global examples. But it is a statutory nonprofit organization that has member states and member provinces. And those member states and member provinces each send policymakers to an annual summit. And the policymakers interact with the private sector and with local government to really talk about the region as a coherent region. So even though British Columbia and Washington State or Saskatchewan and Idaho might be separated by an international border, we have a lot in common and we trade a lot and our citizens move back and forth a lot. So we try and talk about what works for the region versus what works for Canadians versus Americans. And then at the local scale, there's also a very unique institution called the International Mobility and Trade Corridor Program. And that is actually US Customs and Border Protection, Canadian Border Services Agency, and transportation planners on both sides and government agencies on both sides getting together every month. And we get together in a room and we talk about the border. We talk about what's going on at the border. What sort of trends are you seeing for Canadians coming into the US or Americans going into Canada? And from those really on the ground, sometimes fairly technical conversations, we come up with sort of identifying what data don't we have, what information do we need to know, what sort of pilot project might we put together and do at this local, one border crossing that will either prove or disprove some of these federal policies, and then that sort of information gets taken more by this regional advocacy group and advanced in Ottawa and DC. And so that's how sometimes we try to at least shape some of these federal policies from the ground up. So for the final part of my presentation, I wanted to focus on that Cascadia region and talk about other ways that we have these very intimate and very strong relationships of trust and collaboration that are not necessarily grounded in institutions. So this is an image of that Peace Arch crossing that I showed at the beginning with a very long line. And this picture here is one of a gathering, one of many that's held at the Peace Arch crossing. And the Peace Arch is a very unique park that exists in between the border crossing between Canada, which they would be here, and the border crossing into the US, which would be here. There's just this space in between. And if you're in Canada, you can go to the park without entering the United States. And if you're in the US, you can go to the park without entering Canada. So it's actually a very important shared space for many immigrants who can't necessarily enter the United States, where you could, if somebody was coming from the US, you could have lunch together in this park. There's nothing like that on the US-Mexico border, clearly. But the language of this park is something that always strikes me as something that's very fundamental to kind of a cross-border identity that exists in that Cascadia region. And I don't know if you can see it out there, but the terms are children of a common mother, brethren dwelling together in unity, and may these gates never be closed. So very, very strong language of that sort of cross-border nature. Another very interesting example of a regional identity is grounded really in the natural environment of the Cascadia region. We have mountains, we have ocean, we have islands, we have a very strong sort of environmental nature to our identity. And a great example of that is the naming of the Salish Sea. So this map here was created by one of the professors at my university, and you can see there's no international border on the map, and that is intentional. It should be running sort of halfway through. It's hard to tell exactly where it is. But this area was renamed by legal standards, the Salish Sea, in 2010. And the whole idea behind renaming this as one coherent body of water was to erase the border, to say, this is a natural resource, this is the natural environment, the border has no real implications, yet it does if you're studying the border, it does if you're especially a marine scientist whose sort of analysis will stop at the border. Well, if we have a one term, one name, instead of the name for the waters in Canada and the name for the waters in the United States, then that helps to create a more collaborative research environment for researchers on both sides of the border. And I would argue does help to strengthen cross-border collaboration. Another aspect of this very strong cross-border governance framework in the Cascadia region, that's not necessarily grounded in institutions, is our Coast Salish tribes and First Nations. So in Canada, Aboriginal peoples are referred to as First Nations. In the United States, they're referred to as tribes. Well, this is a map of the same region, and this is showing where those tribes and First Nations territories are. And you can see that it's very complex. I think there's over 30 or 40 different nations in this area, but they have come together and created a Coast Salish identity, which allows them to advocate, to participate, increasingly participate in policy decisions. And they play a very important role in that cross-border collaboration. And then finally, I will just briefly mention some very interesting efforts that are happening in the public-private sector. There's something called the Cascadia Innovation Corridor, which is essentially the idea that we have Vancouver and we have Seattle, and they're both becoming increasingly important hubs for technology, for the high-tech sector, for biotech, and it would behoove both British Columbia and Washington State if we had much more collaboration between the two. And so this is an effort that's driven largely by Microsoft. Microsoft has offices both in Vancouver and in Seattle. And if any of you know the difference between Canadian immigration laws and US immigration laws, you could see why a company like Microsoft in the United States might decide to open up an office in Vancouver, because they can access global talent in Vancouver that they can't bring into the United States. And Microsoft isn't the only company. There's a number of different companies that have done this. So there's a lot of push from the private sector to create a more seamless sort of, not just transportation hub, but also movement of workers across the border. And this is supported by the governor of Washington State and the premier of British Columbia that have signed a memorandum of understanding, say, yes, we're going to put resources towards this effort, yes, we're going to support this effort on a political scale. And then finally, there's also the Beyond Preclearance Initiative. Solomon Wong is here, who's involved in this effort. He'll be speaking more about it tomorrow if you're interested about it. But this is a program initiated out of, actually, Vancouver Airport Authority, who has reached out to Intervistas Consulting and said, we're stalled. We don't have a policy framework to advance U.S.-Canadian border policy. So we're not going to wait on our governments in Ottawa and D.C. We're just going to start pushing this forward now, and we're going to start advancing some of these policies really from the ground up, but a pretty innovative program. So my last slide is just to end with a snapshot of what the U.S.-Canadian border looks like in many areas of the border. This does happen to be the Peace Arch crossing here on your left, and then an equivalent picture on the U.S.-Mexico border, and to highlight the differences between them and say both are heavily securitized. Certainly you can't just jump over this ditch that divides the U.S. and Canada. There's cameras everywhere, there's people watching, but this symbolism behind having a wall and having an open border, just symbolically on the landscape, is something that I hope will remain, and I hope that it does point to the level of trust and collaboration between the U.S. and Canada. So that's it, I'm done.
Yeah, so now I'd like to invite Kathryn Friedman to come up.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Laurie, for asking me to participate in this panel. I am research faculty at the University of Buffalo. I have a dual appointment in law and planning. And I'm trained as an international relations specialist and a lawyer, but I hang out with urban planners, urban and regional planners, and I've been heavily influenced over the years by their perspective and their take on subnational cross-border issues. And so my presentation is taking a look at a couple of different lenses to examine economic policy making in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River region. And in particular, I'm looking at a case study of collaboration between New York and Ontario. That's at the state provincial level, but really what I'm looking at goes one layer below, which is economic policy making and the attempt to build an innovation corridor in the binational Buffalo, Niagara, and Southern Ontario region. So we've heard now for at least a decade that cross-border regions are becoming increasingly important in the globalized world of the 21st century. We do know, though, that reaching across a border, or I should say in North America, in my neck of the woods, reaching across the border and collaborating on economic policy or economic development can be quite challenging. It means that you have to navigate and find common purpose between two totally different political systems, economic systems, social systems, and legal systems. Every policy process and decision has to plot a course through various layers of government, all of which, so, for those of you who may not be familiar with North America, we have the federal level, then we have the state provincial level, then we have local systems, and each of these systems has different priorities, different resource commitments, different laws, different policies, and institutions. So needless to say, it's extraordinarily complex. So then for me, I don't even ask why anymore, why collaborate across a border. I'm really interested in how. How do we do it? How do we do it in North America on a continent that does not have a supranational entity? That sort of top-down approach to cross-border regions. How do we do it? And as Laurie just pointed out, they do it very differently out west. It's a very, in my view, a very mature set of relationships that were established, decades ago by some very forward-looking people. In my neck of the woods in Buffalo, Niagara, we're not quite there yet. So, and we'll talk about that during our roundtable. So for me, the question is, how do cross-border regions realize their potential as economic innovation corridors? What are the key attributes of cross-border economic policy making? So to answer those questions, I actually did a review of a couple of different literatures, each of which has a different lens on cross-border economic policy making. First, there's public policy literature that views cross-border economic policy making or economic decision making in terms of cross-border economic clusters. Then there is urban and regional planning literature that focuses on placemaking, that is the relationship between individuals and the place, this sort of dialogue and critique that goes on between experts and people who live in an area in an attempt to create place and create space. A lot of placemaking literature focuses on the importance of data and process in terms of creating a shared discourse. The world that I am most familiar with is the international relations and international law literature, Cohen and Nye, Anne-Marie Slaughter, where they discuss transgovernmental networks or horizontal and vertical networks that, again, cut across jurisdictional boundaries at the national level and then also at the subnational level. And then there's another strain of urban planning literature that I found that really emphasized the role of leadership in networks and really focused on the need for a collaborative style of leadership when you talk about cross-border economic policy making and the particular role that boundary organizations can play in a network when it comes to cross-boundary economic policy making. So, I reviewed the literature, pulled out a couple of attributes, and I thought that I would test those attributes up against an initiative that is currently taking place in the binational Buffalo-Niagara Southern Ontario region. This is a region that is in transition. For those of you who may not be familiar, both Southern Ontario and Buffalo-Niagara are post-industrial economies, both of which are right next to each other on the border. I should have brought a map so you could visualize what I'm talking about. These communities are right next to each other on the border. Both sides of the border, economic development officials on both sides are undertaking economic development planning in almost identical areas. The life sciences, tourism, Niagara Falls is right there, one of the 7 wonders of the world, agro-processing. So they're engaging in economic development and planning processes in parallel, but with very little interaction between economic development officials on both sides of the border. Another very strategic point about this binational region is that it is adjacent to the Greater Golden Horseshoe, right? Toronto, depending on whose statistics you want to give credence to, the 4th largest economy in North America, right? So you have these 2 post-industrial regions embarking on new economic development just south or adjacent to one of the most vibrant innovational economies in the world. And so this is a region in transition, and this is also a region that, quite frankly, is well aware of the potential and the promise that the region holds as a cross-border region in a globalized world. Efforts go back 20, some say even 30 years to attempt to reach across that international border and forge some sort of economic development strategy collectively, but for a whole host of reasons, that's really never panned out. That being said, about 18 months or so ago, a couple of stakeholders in the region, local foundations and economic development officials, essentially came to the universities and said, do something, right? Do something about this. We need leadership. We need, we need entities with that higher perspective, that broader perspective, to begin to convene people again to see if we can possibly achieve the promise of this region. So what we started to do is actually gather data and look at data, and which is a job in and of itself because the data aren't gathered in the same manner. They're gathered at different times during different intervals. It makes it a little challenging. But we began to find that there really are economic clusters in the binational region, and we use the life science cluster as a proof of concept to look at the density and location of a cross-border cluster. And we found that, yeah, well, there does seem to be something to a life science cluster that actually exists in the region. So we have that. With regard to placemaking and shared discourse, we found that an emphasis on data was really, really important in terms of crafting a shared identity in the region. Unlike the Pacific Northwest, where Laurie hails from, I can't say that folks in our region think of themselves or think of itself as a cross-border region, or anybody thinks of themselves as living in a cross-border region. However, we were able to demonstrate that if at the subnational, cross-border regional level, economic development officials strategically aligned and invested in key sectors, there would be an 11% increase in jobs in the life sciences sector and a 17% increase in life sciences economic output. Essentially, that turned into creating more than 1,300 jobs in the life sciences sector and an extra 122 million in economic output alone. When stakeholders saw that data, again, the underlying premise is we're stronger together. It's something that people always sort of intuitively knew, but we actually demonstrated with economic modeling that it could, in fact, be the case. They started to think about the potential a little bit differently. They started to discuss this potential in a way, and it was framed in a way that they had never really thought about before. And so this idea of developing a shared discourse really started to play out. In addition to data playing a role in creating a shared discourse, I can't emphasize enough what I've learned from my colleagues, which is how a good process can be really, really important to crafting a shared identity. Again, if you want to have stakeholders on both sides of the border collaborate on economic development policy, it's kind of, again, intuitive, it's kind of simple. You have to build trust, you have to build relationships, and you need a process to do that. So, we held multiple research team meetings, we held multiple workshops, we had continuous feedback, critique, and communication among the stakeholders in the region during this 18-month process. So, again, that process was really critical to creating this concept of, or notion of, shared discourse in the region. With regard to vertical and horizontal networks and actors, I just listed some of our major supporters, but they cut across scale, they cut across sector, and overall, over the 18-month period, we had more than 80 stakeholder representatives constantly convening and attending these workshops in an effort to be a part of the initiative and push the ball down the field, so to speak, with regard to cross-border economic policy making. And then with regard to that fourth attribute that I found in urban and regional planning literature, there is evidence in this undertaking that's taking place in the Buffalo-Niagara region of a collaborative style of leadership, and that quite frankly, the University of Buffalo and Brock University collectively are almost serving as a boundary organization, mediating boundaries among the different sectors and scales of government. And, you know, it's very preliminary, but there is some evidence that this collaborative style of leadership and this boundary organization is evident and starting to take root there. So at the end of the day, right, my question is always, you know, in addition to how you engage in cross-border economic policy making, my next question I always have is, so what, right? You know, there certainly are some contributions to the literature using a multidisciplinary framework to look at cross-border economic policy making. I'm not aware of any scholarly article that actually looked at those four sets of literature to come up with attributes for cross-border economic policy making. So you can contribute to the academic literature. And also, there's a body of scholarship being developed out there, Jeffrey Hell in particular, and Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, talking about territorial and aterritorial forces at play. All, you know, these forces, the only way I can think of it is a sort of witch's brew, are all swirling around at the same time, impacting our borders, changing our borders. And it's really, sometimes really difficult to get your head wrapped around that. But in our region, I think one of the most important so whats, and this touches also on something that Laurie said and is in contrast to the European Union, is that in the past, you know, the model for cross-border economic policy making, or I should say the goal for cross-border economic policy making, was always, you know, to achieve some sort of harmonization, right? You've seen continuums in the literature that ranging from information sharing, you know, as the lowest level of collaboration, all the way up to some sort of policy harmonization or convergence. And what we found is that at the sub-national cross-border scale in the case study in the Buffalo, Niagara, Southern Ontario region, nobody's interested. Nobody's interested in harmonizing policy. Nobody's interested, nobody's delusional anymore, thinking that Canada and the United States, notwithstanding the Regulatory Cooperation Council and some of the real strengths of the RCC, nobody is really thinking anymore that North America will somehow see the level and the deepening of regulatory convergence like you have in, or regulatory harmonization like you have in the European Union. What people are talking about now is leveraging the border, strategically thinking about the border, leveraging complementarities. Actually, our colleague Bill Anderson refers to this as the binational advantage, looking at where Canada and the United States are different, right? And thinking of those as complementarities that could be leveraged to create economic growth and investment from other parts of the world. So I can't say any longer that the goal is policy harmonization, but really just a recognition that you do have these two different systems, and we have to think differently about them and think more strategically about them if we want to leverage the border and strengthen cross-border regions, at least in my neck of the woods. So that's it. That's it. Thank you.
And then we're going to invite our last presenter up, Kathryn.
Take it down.
It's okay, I got it.
All right, well, hello everyone. I am Kathryn Richardson, and I'm an associate professor at San Jose State University in San Jose, California. But I do want to say that I have lived and grew up in the Cascadia region. So I've lived and I still have a home in Vancouver, Canada, a townhouse in Portland, and an apartment in San Jose. So I'm very much well experienced with the west coast of North America. So I'm going to give you a bird's eye view into some of the work that I've just completed. In fact, here, I actually just put out a book last year on the Canada-US border and movements of highly skilled foreigners that move between Vancouver, Seattle, and San Francisco, Silicon Valley area for purposes of work. So basically what I'm going to present for the next 18 minutes is kind of a summary of this particular book here. I know it's late, but hopefully this will keep you interested. All right. So basically, the main thrust of the book focuses on how to manage the borders in an era of globalization in a post-9/11 security environment, and now with U.S. President Trump's administration. So basically, one of the big themes of the book looks at the tension between the notion of a border as a sieve, which allows flows easily, and then also the border as a shield, where there's basically forces that are up and prohibit movements. The driving question to the research project was, is the Canada-US border an impediment to a cross-border high-tech cluster, and I should say between Vancouver and Seattle under NAFTA, which is a North American free trade agreement. And then actually what we have right here, Laurie was giving us an idea of the Vancouver-Seattle corridor, and here we have another satellite image of it. And so what I'm doing with, ooh, heavens, hang on, there we go. So with the little cursor here, this is the Vancouver, British Columbia area. And then, let me see, okay, and then right about here is the actual Canada-US border, okay? And we kind of trot along a little further down, and this is the greater Seattle area, okay? So what you're looking at is basically what Laurie talked about as the Salish Sea, or the northern portion of what is called the Cascadia region. And David McCloskey, who is a retired professor at Seattle University, coined the term Cascadia, okay? All right. So to give us some background, basically we've been talking a lot about border regions between Canada and the U.S., and the Cascadia area is distinctive in the sense not only along the Canada-U.S. border, but also between a lot of border regions in the world generally, in the sense that importantly, both sides of the Canada-U.S. border, when we think about our two major cities, which are Vancouver and Seattle, is that both of them have a heavy high-tech economy, which is dependent on highly skilled talent. The other issue, though, like I mentioned a moment ago, is that you have two metropolitan cores, Vancouver and Seattle. If you look at numbers of population, anywhere the city core, city proper, Vancouver's around 600,000, and I think Seattle's around 700,000. Similar economies, high-tech, but also they have a history of forestry, farming, and fishing, and very similar histories in regards to their development, and that's very unusual. A lot of cities along border regions are very uneven. Say, for example, you have El Paso, Juarez, San Diego, Tijuana, so you have one city that might be seen as very, if you will, modern and advanced and peppered with an advanced economy, whereas the other city on the other side of the border, not necessarily so, okay, light manufacturing, low services, and that sort of thing. So it's unusual to have two cities along a border that are relatively comparable. Okay, so basically one of the big thrusts in the book, though, it looks at how effective and how influential has Chapter 16 of NAFTA been, once again, North American Free Trade Agreement, when it comes to moving professionals between Seattle and the Seattle-Vancouver corridor. And to give you a little bit of background, basically Chapter 16 of NAFTA deals with movements of people, of professionals, investors, traders, intercompany transferees, and I just focused with my work primarily on the movement of 65 professionals that are listed under NAFTA. So if you're a Canadian economist, you can get a job in the United States. If you're a Mexican zoologist, you can get a job in Canada under NAFTA. Okay, so there are basically 65 different professions. And what was really interesting and seen as highly sellable, if you will, to U.S. Congress when NAFTA was proposed in the early 1990s was that a person who was being offered a job, say for example, a Canadian national is offered a job as a software engineer in the United States, he or she could actually go to the port of entry that he or she wanted to cross, present all their paperwork, and ideally in about 10 to 15 minutes time, the person would be able to be granted entry and given his or her visa. And it was in opposition to what's called the H-1B visa, which is basically the visa that's given to many foreign professional workers in the U.S. when they're offered a professional job. The downside to the H-1B visa is that it's very expensive and time-consuming and extremely limited, whereas this thing called the T-in, or the Treaty NAFTA visa, was supposed to be really easy, fast, and it shouldn't have to include a lawyer. So that was a big selling point to it. But the challenge, what I found, what started a lot of the research, that was that what was happening, though, with a lot of Canadians who were going to these U.S. ports of entry with all of their paperwork, and ideally everything was supposed to be in order, they were getting hung up at the border. They were being told by U.S. port of entry officers, no, you don't have the right paperwork, no, you're not a software engineer, no, I've never heard of that university. So there was a lot of impediments that were starting to come up against supposedly this mechanism through NAFTA that was supposed to encourage free movement of professionals. So, okay. And then, of course, we have two images, so of Vancouver and Seattle, terribly, well, I think they're very different, but a lot of people think that they look very, very similar. So anyway, I'll let you visit and find out. All right. Now, and just do it quickly with a literature review, and I know it's late, so I won't belabor this, but quickly, so I did Borders and Borderlands, focused on industrial clusters and innovative regions. A third component of the literature looked at transnationalism and internationally highly skilled labor. And then finally, thinking about the institutions that govern international labor mobility. And so I looked at in addition to NAFTA, I looked at the GATS, a General Agreement on Trade and Services, and then also, say, like domestic policies when it comes to international labor, say, like Canada's labor policies, and then also the U.S. Okay, and then to give us a little bit of background here, in thinking about numbers of people who actually enter the U.S. on a NAFTA status, interestingly, it's pretty much grown quite steadily from 1994 until 2009. And what you see there is roughly about 99,000 or about 100 people, and then, or 100,000 people, and then all of a sudden in 2010 it skyrockets to 634,000 people, okay? Now importantly, that would, if that number was correct as in regards to numbers of T and visa statuses that were issued, and almost all of them went to Canadians as opposed to Mexicans, and there's a bit of a story there as to why Mexicans weren't given T and visas for a long time. but all of a sudden it skyrockets, and it's not, and if that number was true, it would wipe out the entire high-tech industry of Canada. So what happened in 2010 was that the infinite wisdom of the Department of Homeland Security, they stopped counting TN statuses that were issued, and they started counting just numbers of people who crossed the border who had a TN status, okay? So for example, if you were given a TN status in March and then you had to go and see your mother in May for Mother's Day and then possibly returning again in July for Canada Day, and then you might go back for Labor Day, you would actually count as 4, okay, as opposed to, so you would count as 4 in regards to numbers of flows as opposed to just one TN visa that was issued. So the challenge with the data around how many people actually have TN statuses is kind of murky. But basically it's estimated that, oh gosh, over the last 25 years that NAFTA has been around, guesstimates of around 250,000 to 300,000 Canadians have had a TN status at one time, okay? So just quickly with the methodology, how did I go about the work? For the most part, I did a lot of semi-structured, in-depth interviews. And at this point, I'm actually on to another research project that's, and I'll talk about that at the end, but right now I've done over 92 in-depth interviews, and it includes 24 Canadian and U.S. immigration attorneys, 24 Canadian and U.S. immigration officials, 26 Canadian and U.S. high-tech firms, primarily based in Vancouver, Canada, Seattle, Washington, and/or Silicon Valley, Greater San Francisco area. And then also 6 key policymakers for labor mobility under NAFTA, basically based in Ottawa and Washington, D.C. And then just from a textual analysis perspective, I reviewed company reports, web pages, and relevant government reports and documents. And just a little image that I'm showing here is actually, it's actually Pixar Studios, which is based in Burbank, California, but they actually put an R&D center in Vancouver for about 3 years. But interestingly, I'll get to this later, they pulled out. They decided to not be based in Vancouver, okay? So they were only there temporarily, but that's where that photo comes. It seems kind of odd and postmodern, but that's the story behind it. So just quickly thinking about some of the questions that I asked, and the driver, like I said, was, is the Canada-U.S. border an impediment to the development of a high-tech region within Cascadia in the area of NAFTA? And then some of the more detailed questions and asking firms about how helpful has Chapter 16 of NAFTA been for your line of work or your employees? Are there difficulties around it? What exactly do you do as strategies to alleviate some of these problems, if you have them? And then movements of September 11th, how did that affect flows and your professionals and your firm when it comes to moving people back and forth across the border, okay? And I'm actually in the process now of basically, rather than asking about 9/11, it's more the Trump administration and how has that affected your firm? Okay, so interestingly, so with the firms, some of the main findings was that all the firms interviewed, whether they were based in Vancouver, Canada, Seattle, or Silicon Valley, Greater San Francisco area, was that they all had a real strong demand to hire the internationally highly skilled. They had to hire high talent, okay? Whether they were a firm of 3 people up to a firm that employed worldwide anywhere between 30 to 100,000 people. They all had to have access to extremely highly skilled people. The other really interesting issue, despite the fact that there is firms in Seattle and San Francisco, Silicon Valley area, which I'm going to talk about at the end, and which I'm studying right now, of moving and creating R&D facilities in Vancouver, maybe permanently, maybe temporarily. But interestingly, what I found with the research was that for the most part, the region of economic Cascadia for these firms was really a minor destination point for the majority of the firms. Interestingly, what I found, especially for Vancouver-based firms, was that their greater connectivity was to California. Okay, it was to San Francisco and San Diego, LA. all right? The other component they connected up with was actually the East Coast, okay? New York, Washington, D.C., New Jersey. And then the other component was the rest of the world. The other issue, in thinking about visas, was that there was a lot of what you would call visa ambiguity for firms. They were confused about what was the best visa to use. Should they use an H-1B if they were having problems getting their people over the border under a NAFTA or a TN? Could they possibly move the person over the border as an intercompany transferee, which is an L? Some firms, they're not supposed to, but some firms were moving people across the border on a B, which is a B1, which is basically a visitor, a business visitor visa, but they were doing work, okay? So there was a lot of visa ambiguity. What happened, though, after 9/11 was that firms started to develop strategies to navigate the cross-border system. So it ranged from everything from lying when they went across the port of entry to hiring attorneys, to actually having to reach out and spend the money to hire a lawyer. Okay? The other really important point that came about through the research was that NAFTA, despite all of its complaints and its hang-ups and its problems at the border, it actually worked 85% of the time. Okay, so comparatively speaking, before NAFTA was created in 1994, actually a lot of firms talked about if the TN visa is issued and it's available and if it's easy to get, it's actually really easy. And it lasts for 3 years, and it was fairly inexpensive compared to the H-1B. So for all the complaining around the TN visa, it actually worked pretty well. The other issue that was actually a key finding with the firms was that the aftermath of 9/11 did not stop the movement of firm personnel across the Canada-US border. So once again, despite all of the hype and the concern about walling up the border and the economy stopping and there was a lot of rhetoric around this, it wasn't necessarily the case. People were still able to get across the border. Okay, and so just quickly, here's a quote from one of the firms about lying. And so the question was, is the Canada-US border an impediment to the development of a high-tech cluster within Cascadia? And so he contradicts himself. He says, well, yes, it is. However, if a firm or a person finds the right pigeonhole when crossing the border, then it's okay. We must move back and forth into Seattle. Hence, you know the port and what to say. For example, you say, if we're just going to Microsoft for a meeting, then it's okay. They know Microsoft. I was traveling with one of the guys and he said just that. We're going to Microsoft, but we weren't. We were going to a different firm. I pointed it out to him as we drove through, but he shrugged and said, hey, it's so much easier to say that than another firm. They know Microsoft. Once you know what to say, then it's okay. All right. So interestingly, that's a strategy of getting across the border. Now, the other group that I interviewed were immigration officers, both Canadian and American. And so thinking about it, though, what they found, what U.S. and Canadian, both U.S. and Canadian firms found, because they had to move people both ways, they found the Canadian ports of entry to be much more consistent from port of entry to port of entry, whereas the U.S. ports varied considerably, okay? So, for example, Laurie showed us the Peace Arch crossing, which is the main crossing between Vancouver and Seattle, but about a half mile to the east. There's the truck crossing, okay, and that's kind of where more of the locals go. But interestingly, it's called port shopping, and so a lot of immigration attorneys will say, take it to the truck crossing. You'll get a better review as opposed to the Peace Arch crossing. Okay, so that was an example, though, of how ports of entry varied considerably. The other issue, though, is that since 9/11, the power of frontline immigration officers had increased considerably. Okay, so that was quite prolific, especially for the U.S. The Canadian officers, although they were seen as facilitative, and the U.S. officers were seen as restrictive, Canadian port of entry officers have actually many more laws on behalf of the state where they can retain, they can interrogate, and do lots of things to you that U.S. officers are only starting to be able to do. okay? But importantly, though, the U.S. since 9/11 was becoming more like Canada in its ongoing educational and professionalism training, and interestingly, powers granted to port of entry directors, okay? So after 9/11, port of entry directors had something called discretionary authority. So for example, and I was given this example in my interview, one Canadian man was going to go to Hawaii with his wife and children, and he had been brought up on charges when he was about 19 or 20 of possession of marijuana in the United States. And so he had a criminal record, but he's now in his late 40s. And sadly, he and his family, well, he wasn't allowed to go, but his wife and kids were, but they all decided to stay. He wasn't allowed to go into the U.S. because of this. And so when I was interviewing the port of entry director, he said, now that I have discretionary authority, I could override that, and I could make the decision to let this person go, because it happened so long ago, and he hadn't done anything else in that time frame. And then the other important issue, though, is that Canada, since 9/11, was actually becoming more like the U.S. and its increased efforts towards enforcement at ports of entry. And importantly, in that time, the Canada Border Services Agency was created, okay? And so Canada, so even though the U.S. was becoming more like Canada, Canada was also becoming more like the U.S., okay? And then finally, with immigration attorneys, they were not supposed to be involved at all with Chapter 16 of NAFTA. And initially, after 9/11, it was devastating to their practices. And the other important fact, though, is that through my research, there was a strong working relationship between the U.S. immigration officers, or excuse me, U.S. immigration officers and attorneys. But importantly, since 9/11, there was a deliberate distance between the U.S. Port of Entry officers and U.S. attorneys. Historically, U.S. immigration attorneys would go to the port of entry with their client and kind of stand there with them. And I think it was in 2003 they actually started pulling up these old regulations and banning them from the port of entry unless their client was under a criminal investigation. Now, importantly, in Canada, an attorney is not allowed to go with their client. Okay, so once again, the U.S. was becoming more like Canada in this instance. Now, importantly, finally, like I said earlier, NAFTA was supposed to eliminate, or there shouldn't have been a need for attorneys, but now attorneys are needed more than ever for firms trying to send employees across the Canada-U.S. border, okay? So I'll let you read the conclusions, but importantly, after 9/11, basically the attorneys won. So that being the case, it's an interesting story. But just in sum, with the U.S.-Canadian interpretations of NAFTA, it's changed over time. So in thinking about the original spirit of border openness in the 90s, it's become more restrictive and erratic. Okay, and then I talked about port shopping earlier. Geography still matters. Okay, and the other key thing, though, is that with the Trump administration, what's happening is that we're seeing greater reverse flows with U.S.-based firms establishing R&D centers in Canadian cities, such as Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, and Google. And then finally, the Canada Border Services Agency has been increasingly restrictive as well. So anyway, so that concludes it. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you all. It was really interesting. And we want to try just now to have a really short sort of round table. I have a couple of questions to ask our presenters, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience as well. But just to start, so the example of the park, there is a park, Friendship Park in San Diego, Tijuana, and it's been around for a long time, 100 years or so. And it's increasingly just being closed more and more, and it seems like the officials on the U.S. side in particular try and find excuses. First, they closed it because they said people were throwing volleyballs over that were filled with drugs. They had conversations about they had a surprise wedding at the border last time because they would open up the gates every month or so and allow people to come and meet each other and, you know, and talk to each other, families that are separated. And again, a couple came and got married. She's on the Mexican side, he's on the U.S. side. They couldn't cross, and the border officials were shocked. And so then they said, no more opening up the border because we can't have these surprise weddings happening. So there's many things that are changing within the security framework, and a tone that seems to be going on through all of your presentations is, what do we really do about the federal government? And is the federal government really becoming a problem for border communities within the North American context? And is it something that border communities should think about doing something about the problem? And I'll just let each of you take just a minute to sort of answer that. And understanding that the federal national governments are very important to regional development and coordination and cooperation, but what do we do about when the government becomes a problem?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say yes, the federal government is a problem. And, like we all talked about, the U.S. and Canada have had fantastic relations for a very long period of time, but that relationship ebbs and flows. And I think that's the risk of putting too much stake and sort of too much trust, or not trust isn't the word, but letting the federal government decide things puts all of us who live in border communities at the risk of this sort of ebb and flow. And if we can find ways to leverage local, regional efforts to shape policies the way we want to, those are going to be a lot more stable because, as I said before, the people who live in border communities, we're the ones who are most affected by the border, and we're the most engaged, and we know more than the federal government does about what works at different border crossings and what doesn't. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I echo, or to echo your comments about the ebb and flow, I think that's absolutely correct. And at one of our stakeholder work group meetings, we actually talked about the challenges of the federal government and the ebb and flow of relations. Even when relations are good, there's still changes in policy that impact stakeholders that they found challenging. So for example, 9/11, right? I mean, Canada and the U.S. had a great relationship pre-9/11. 9/11 happens, border shuts down. It really, I think, highlighted how federal policy impacts folks in the border regions. Stakeholders in our neck of the woods essentially have recognized that, but said that they use the word tactical. We need to be very tactical in terms of continuing to forge cross-border relationships and strategies and programs in the face of all of this uncertainty that's currently going on.
Very good question. I wanted to come back to what I talked about earlier with the idea of sieve or shield when it comes to the border. And importantly, what I found with my research is that for regional interests, there's a lot of notions around a sieve, okay? So wanting the border open, especially for economic purposes. The federal government or on behalf of the nation state usually likes to control borders. That's one of its driving purposes. Mm-hmm. Now, importantly, over the last 20 years, though, there have been a lot of efforts at the federal level to reach out to the local, to reach out to the regional, to find out what the needs and the agendas are. It just seems like currently, especially in the U.S. And along the Canada-U.S. border, there hasn't been a lot of I think we talked about trust. I think Laurie talked about trust and communication, and it seems like that is at this time lacking. And so it seems like perhaps, the federal government, there may be challenges and issues that weren't there 10, 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And there's really, I find, a lack of dialogue that mm-hmm. where there was a lot of constant dialogue, it's not necessarily as consistent as it was.
So in building off that and thinking about trust and dialogue, I mean, what do you think needs to happen? I mean, historically, the U.S.-Canadian border was, the longest, most open border. So what needs to happen for that trust and dialogue to return to the U.S.-Canadian border?
Who would like to answer?
Well, I think it certainly can strengthen and continue at the subnational level. I mean, that's just, you see it in Penwar out west at the state provincial level. In our region, New York and Ontario don't have that kind of relationship, so it really is subnational stakeholders at the local scale who are trying to build trust and dialogue and relationships. So again, in contrast to the European Union, where it was like sort of this top-down approach, this is really more, it's really more bottom-up. I think in the face of what's going on, I don't know, I mean, agencies are talking, right? You know, Canada-US agencies are talking. There's a lot of rhetoric out there, but there is work getting done. But that doesn't, I'm not saying that the rhetoric isn't damaging. It is.
So I would say the exact same thing you said, but the problem we're up against is just a few weeks ago, there was a US Senator who, I don't know if he was tweeting or if it was in a newspaper, but he said something to the effect of, well, you know, the open border with Canada was half of how the 9/11 hijackers came to the United States. This was a US Senator saying that the 9/11 hijackers came from Canada. And that means that we have a weak border policy with Canada. Well, we all know that they came legally on State Department issued visas from all over the world. But this fear-mongering, and the Canadian border is a very big target of this because it's considered a weak, open border by many politicians. So the fear-mongering is something that we're up against in a very serious way, I think.
I'm going to just...
I think that that's a very good point, that things are still happening, but I also want to say that it really does start, although there are a lot of bottom-up, leadership is very important. Leadership is very important, and those in those positions need to take that seriously.
So again, following up on that, in thinking about the differences, because there seem to be many differences between Cascadia, or thinking about the southern Ontario, Buffalo, Niagara region, why do you think those differences exist sub-regionally?
Well, from my perspective, I think Laurie hit the nail on the head when she said that her region, maybe it's distance. I think it might have something to do with political culture, but that region has always been more do-it-yourself, forget about the feds. It's been more collaborative, right? Even at, you know, within the state of Washington, you have regional approaches to economic development. Like in New York State, it's a home rule state, right? So each local government is empowered to, and quite frankly, the system is set up for them not to cooperate or collaborate or cooperate. So it's a totally different, I think, political culture. It's a different institutional setup, and I think that translates into cross-border issues.
Oh, no, I definitely agree with Kathryn. And then also, importantly, the different histories. I'm a geographer, and the settlement patterns, not only of, well, of course, of First Nations peoples, but also the different settlement patterns along the Canada-US border brought about different types of cultures. And then Kathryn has a really good point, though, that a lot of these collaborations, although some of it is grassroots and bottom-up, when it comes to dealing with your neighbor across the border, a lot of times the states or the provinces at a subnational level perhaps have the most power to do those sorts of things. So it really differs based on the different culture of each state and each province and how they choose to engage.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you so much. I think it's an interesting paradigm to think about the future of the role of the national government versus the states and the local, and what does it mean to really empower the locals as we move forward. You know, I listened to a presentation earlier where there wasn't a strong national overlay, and the locals just competed, and there was additional borders that became from internal borders because there wasn't a strong national cohesiveness that brought it around. So we'll have to kind of wait and see what happens within our North American borders. With that, I'd like to open it up to any questions there might be in the audience. We have about 5 minutes or so. Yes.
It's good to see
Yep.
Pretty good presentation. Question for Kathryn. You talk about the idea that folks in Buffalo and nine regions do not have a common view of sharing. I saw a statistic recently indicating that there are 6,000 commuters who cross the Detroit-Windsor border every day, primarily to work in the Detroit area health system. Have you or your colleagues ever done any work to determine the number of cross-border commuters in the Buffalo-Niagara region?
It's very sporadic and anecdotal. We've never looked at cross-border commuters. Jeffrey, gosh, I'm going back like maybe 10 years or so. I think we tried, but we couldn't we either couldn't get the data, or we didn't have enough funding to get the data. But we did look at other linkages. So we did look at academic institutions and students crossing the border. We looked at not the number of people who worked in the healthcare industry or in hospitals in Western New York, but the number of people from Canada who relied on the Western New York healthcare system for their care. They left the Canadian system and came down to the States for one reason or another. So we did some of that number crunching, tourism, right? But I can tell you it was very labor intensive, very arduous, and we haven't replicated it.
Thanks. Is there another question? Yes, Victor.
I'll try to speak louder than this can hear me. We are all learning, particularly about the Borders and Globalization Project, which is Canada-centered, of ancient territoriality, that our borders are becoming more ancient territorial. Yet, what we're finding at the same time is that we're getting more and more reordering processes, and as Laurie has pointed out, and all of you have acknowledged. So where is this pushing the border? What kind of border are we going to end up with when we get into the States after over a century of knowing what the border is? Where is it going?
Well, I think in the US example, it's going to biometrics quite clearly, so that you'll have the situation which we heard about when there's some of us in DC recently, where you go to the airport and, I mean, this is true in Canada as well, but say you're bound for the United States through pre-clearance or something, you go to the airport and it's all biometrics and you don't actually ever encounter a border officer. You're cleared in some office somewhere, maybe in DC, where somebody's watching a camera and they're matching your biometrics to your facial recognition. I would have thought that was sci-fi, but USCBP has done all of the research and proven all of the technology, and I think that's something that's coming to North America likely sooner than later. Now, the privacy implications of that are far from being worked out. But when we talk about biometrics and facial recognition, I don't know where that puts the border. Everywhere, right? You're constantly being tested against some sort of database, and I think that is where we are going.
Yes.
Just a question, very interesting presentations on legal mobility. One thing that I'm curious about is the concept or the systems associated with permanent residence. So permanent residence in Canada, legal permanent residence in the United States. If the theory is that there's greater economic integration across borders and that there's more and more self, have there been any studies about
There we go. Okay, so basically to clarify your question, you're asking, for example, like the status, what about a permanent resident of Canada wanting to come into the US and do work? Okay, for that person, how would that go? Under NAFTA, it would not apply. The person has to be a Canadian citizen. Okay, or the person has to be a Mexican citizen, or they have to be an American citizen. Permanent residency doesn't work, okay? Where permanent residency kind of has the same rights as a citizen is when you're wanting to seek access to that country that's given you permanent residency. Although in the US situation, it's kind of changing. Does that help? But you're saying, what about this ambiguity of a permanent resident in Canada wanting to do business in the US? What? Okay, like a business visitor. Okay, and it really depends on if whatever citizenship that person has, like say for example India, the question then would be, does India have a trade agreement with the United States that encompasses business visitor visas? Okay, say for example like the E2, the E1 and the E2, treaty trader, treaty investor, that falls under NAFTA. Okay, so if NAFTA went away, people on E1 and E2s from Canada would lose that status. Does that help? Okay, okay.
All right, I want to thank the panelists once again. We're really out of time now, and they're trying to come in here, but it was a great panel. Thank you all for your time. And thank you all for coming.